Hi, I'm Steve Gann. I'm a climate scientist and an advocate for action on climate change. I've asked Dr. James Conca, a geochemist and energy researcher, whether we can break our dependence on fossil fuel and go carbon free. Dr. Conca is one of a growing number of scientists who say, yes, we can turn this ship around and go carbon free. We can replace coal, oil, and natural gas with a combination of carbon-free energy sources and reach zero carbon emissions by 2050. Here's Dr. Conca.
Great, thank you. So really, I like to think of these talks as the subtext is things you should keep in mind. If you don't keep them in mind, they will bite you later, and you may not have time to deal with them on the time scale that you want to achieve this on. So everyone talks about achieving a zero carbon energy mix. That's great. Call it a Green New Deal, whatever you want to do. I tend to not use the Green New Deal much because, as most of you know, it's more than just energy. It's business development. It's social justice. It's wages, things like that I'm not an expert on at all. So I stick to the green part of it, the technology part of it, and the global aspects, which can get pretty political, as you can imagine. But pretty much just these are the things you need to keep in mind. So the question is, can we achieve a near zero carbon energy mix by mid-century? The answer is yes. So thank you all for coming. No. so it's yes, but can we, will we do the things we need to do? And it's a huge political will issue, as well as understanding the system well enough that you don't hurt a bunch of people trying to do good. And so that's not a trivial thing. As Steve mentioned, I write for Forbes now. There's the site down there, but just Google James Conca, just Google Conca Forbes and whatever subject, and I'll come up. But it's very funny because right now people think of me as the press. I get these calls now, and I want to digress a little bit because it's funny because I'm now the press, which is hilarious because I'm a PhD scientist for 35 years. And now people are more interested in my writing for Forbes than they are that I have a PhD from Caltech. And which is interesting because that tells you the approach you have to take. Just being a scientist doesn't really mean much, especially right now, with science kind of in retreat, unfortunately. So keep that in mind as well. So this is the global energy distribution geographically around the world. It's generated from 24 trillion kilowatt hours a year. That's what we do as humans. And it's going to go to 35 trillion plus kilowatt hours per year by 2040. So these numbers are big. You got to keep them in mind because they are so big, but they're incredibly important. So right now we're at 24 trillion kilowatt hours a year, going to 35. And the nice thing about these NASA nighttime shots, this was about 10 years ago, so it's gotten a lot brighter, is that you can tell right away who has energy and who doesn't. It's what the fighting's all about. It's what it's always been all about. And it also determines who's going to do what and why. Now, if you look at the distribution by type, by energy source, let me move this over here. This is the world energy distribution in 2019. It's pretty much 2/3 fossil fuel. So 2/3 fossil fuel, 1/3 split kind of evenly between hydro and nuclear. I won't talk about transportation too much, but it's still dominated by petroleum, a little bit of biofuels, but it's pretty much all petroleum. So if you don't deal with the transportation, you pretty much miss 1/3 of the issue because petroleum isn't used that much to produce electricity around the world or heat or power, except in the Middle East or during polar vortexes in the Northeast United States. So, but again, the world is 2/3 fossil fuel, 1/3 hydronuclear with a little bit of other. The United States, of course, it depends on where you live. The United States is also 2/3 fossil fuel, a little more gas, a little less coal, a little more nuclear, a little less hydro. Renewables are coming up. But again, it's very dependent on where you live. Washington is the least carbon of all the states because of hydro, nuclear, renewables. We only have one coal plant that is set to expire in 2025, and we have a couple of gas plants. The coal plant is going to be replaced by gas, unfortunately. West Virginia is the heaviest coal, heaviest carbon footprint. Illinois is the biggest nuclear footprint. European Union, a little bit more nuclear because of France, a little less hydro. Korea, significant nuclear. They were planning, before Fukushima, they were planning to be 60% nuclear, as was Japan. And if you don't understand why, it's because they have no resources to speak of. They have no fossil fuel resources. Their wind resources and solar resources are pretty bad. They don't have biomass resources. They cannot feed themselves. So they pretty much have to import everything. So if you don't want to be dependent on someplace like China or another country, nuclear is the best bet. China doesn't look like much as far as, I mean, it's all coal, still all coal with a lot of hydro. Nuclear doesn't look like much, but they pretty much are breaking ground on a new nuclear plant every month. Oops. So this is the world power consumption growth curve. It's very steep. It has nothing to do with the United States. The United States was last century. This is the new century, and it's everyone else but us. Presently, the world is at 24 trillion kilowatt hours. If we look at, where we're going, are we going to go up ad infinitum? We're going to turn over, and I suggest about 33, 35. So if we look at fossil fuel right now, which is 2/3 of the present 24 trillion kilowatt hours per year, if we're going to go to only 33 or so, we're going to have to come up with a huge amount of non-fossil fuel, more than all the fossil fuel we have now. We're going to have to come up with that much plus in non-fossil fuel sources simply to get to that point. That's not even cutting back any fossil fuel. So this is a huge lift, and this is what it's all about. These numbers, again, they're big, but you really need to keep them in mind because they're really big numbers. And you have to do it all. You just can't do it in one country or another or one state or another. I mean, it's a good thing to start, but if you don't reach a significant amount of the world, then you're not going to reach this goal. Now, the reason that curve is so steep is because of these people. 1.2 billion people still have no access to electricity whatsoever. 2.4 billion people still burn wood manure as their main source of energy, and 3 more billion are going to be born by 2040, 2045. So that's a lot of people. And you could say, well, forget about them. We have ours, stop it. We don't want them to have any energy, which is actually kind of mean because it turns out it takes about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year to lift someone up out of poverty. It's what it takes. Nothing else really will do it except energy. So what all the climate meetings are about, especially COP21, was pretty much how to give these people 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year without giving them coal, and then who's going to pay for it. All the other discussions were subsets of that. How do we do it without giving them coal, and who's going to pay for it? And it turns out this is the only way to eradicate global poverty and its evil stepchildren, war and terrorism. So we have this basic dynamic tension between humans and the planet, and the humans simply want to live nicely, and the planet wants to survive. So we're often at crosswise to that, and you simply have to find a way to do it correctly. But you're not going to prevent, and it's really an ethical issue, should you try to prevent people from getting 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, because that's, again, lifts them out of poverty. Now, the nice thing about that is when you lift them out of poverty, the birth rate plummets. And so the best birth control in the world has always been access to energy. That's why the aristocracy always died out. Now, this is not secret. We've known this for many years. If any of you know something called the Human Development Index, so I would Google United Nations Human Development Index. It's really a neat concept. And it turns out that the first term in the equation of happiness is access to energy. So if you have access to energy, about 3,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, your life is pretty good. So let me do these, the units here. So Human Development Index from 0 to 1. If you're at 1, life is as good as could possibly be. If you're above zero point 0.9, which is most of the industrialized world, life is pretty good, or can be pretty good. Not for, it's not obviously for everyone, but in general, it could be very, very good. If you're below 0.4, life is absolutely horrible. I mean, absolutely horrible. You spend 6 hours a day just finding water. So this is, this is what this is about. Now, when we talk about energy in this group, the industrialized world, we talk about, electric vehicles, energy efficiency, complex fluorescence. We talk about moving us down. And the UK is actually pretty good. They're at about 6,000 kilowatt hours, a little over 6,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, which is great. Japan in 1992 was at 16,000, and they have come screaming down. So they, technology is good. You can do this. You can decrease energy use dramatically, and their standard of living is tremendous. I put California in here as its own country. Supposed to get a laugh. And but California in general is much warmer, marine climate, and that's great. Now Canada's up here, and you say, well, they'll never get down here. They're really big and they're really cold. And so even with global warming, they're not going to get down there very much, but there's not that many people in that group, so it doesn't affect the global issues. So if you want to really talk about the countries that affect global issues, of course, you talk about the US, China, India. China's funny. I mean, 0.8 is not bad, but there's two parts to China now. There's 800 million middle-class Chinese. Now that is staggering, since your economic and military power derive directly from the absolute number of middle class in your society, not the relative amount, the absolute number. Now they still have 600 million in abject poverty, and all of their policies, whether it's military, political, economic, is to raise these 600 million up here as well. So and they tend to do what they try. By mid-century, China will have 1 billion middle class. Now, the reason, during the Industrial Revolution, beginning in 1850 and 1870, the British developed coal, right? And that was just a game changer. So they suddenly were making battleships made of steel, and they ran rings around everyone else. So it was no question that they dominated the second half of the 19th century. By 1870, England had 10 million middle class. Now that was huge. No one else had a middle class. I mean, there was a merchant class, but there was no middle class. And so they just, dominated. Then in the turn of the 19th century, 20th century, the United States, we had a lot of coal, but we discovered oil and we used it well. The Brits didn't like oil because they didn't have much at that time. So in World War I, we were running oil-fired battleships, and it ran rings around the coal-fired battleship. So again, this is the evolution of energy. And then we came, with gas and then hydro and nuclear. So by 1950, the United States had 100 million middle class, and we dominated the world. By 1970, we had 200 million middle class. Now in 1992, China didn't have very much at all. They were just finally shrugging off the effects of the Cultural Revolution, and they decided in 1992 that they were going to build 600 coal-fired power plants, and they did in 18 years. And that was amazing. I mean, that was incredible. So, but it catapulted them onto the world stage in terms of the number of middle class and in terms of economic and military power. It was really fast. They're still adjusting to it, of course. But by mid-century, they will have 1 billion middle class, and that's something to keep in mind. Now, there is a sweet spot here. If you can get everyone down to about 6,000 kilowatt hours per person per year and everyone down here up to about 4,000, you can eradicate global poverty. And again, it's evil stepchildren, war, and terrorism. It's pretty much the only way to do it. And that's why energy use is going up and up. So what do we need then if we're going to achieve socioeconomic parity and a good life for everyone, and that's what everyone is aiming for? independent of climate issues. Well, we got to cut the industrialized world down to 6,000 kilowatt hours per person per year, kicking and screaming. That's okay. We don't need 10,000, 12,000 kilowatt hours a year. That's wasteful. But there's only about 1 billion people in this subgroup. There's a bunch at 3,000. Keep them there. That's great. We need to increase these two groups, the developing world that has 5 billion people in it, and those coming on board by mid-century, which is another 3.5 billion. So we're talking about 33 trillion kilowatt hours. So that's why I mentioned that number. Now, this is if you equitably distribute the energy amongst everyone in the world, and we're not very good at that. So it'll take more. I would guess about 40 trillion kilowatt hours if we're going to achieve peace and prosperity in the world. Now, there's a lot working against that, but that's the goal. That's the goal from the human side. Now, what about the goal from the planet side? This is climate change for the last 550 million years. I apologize for the busyness of the slide. In order to get 550 million years on one slide, the legend changes slightly. So over here, it's thousands of years, then hundreds of thousands, millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions. So it's compressed as you go back, of course. What should jump out at you, and I wish I could ask in a class I would, what jumps out at you here should be that it's really cold now. It's been really, really cold for the last 10 million years, unusually cold for planet Earth. Planet Earth is not generally this cold. So much so that for the last 2.5 million years, we've had glaciation, which is an odd thing on planet Earth. It doesn't occur that often. You can see here where it occurs in the past. Pretty much you have to not just have the astronomical geometry correct, but you have to have land masses at the poles. You have to have plates near the poles in order to build up enough ice to cause glaciation. If you don't, it won't happen. So that's why it really didn't happen much until about 1.5 billion years ago. It was the first glaciation we can tell, because there wasn't enough landmass. So everyone says, well, it's cold and all that. Whoops. Ooh. Sorry. What you see here, I'm not sure it's being blocked or anything, but we're coming out of it very fast. So we've been cold for 10 million years. We're coming out of it extraordinarily fast. And you've probably heard a lot of people, especially climate deniers, say, well, it's been warmer in the past. Look at this. It's been really warm. So, who cares? Or CO2 concentrations have been much higher in the past. So that's no big deal, right? And, no, it's wrong, because it has nothing to do with the absolute temperature or the absolute concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. It's the rate of change. Life does not like change. Okay? I mean, I don't like change. My cats don't like change. No one likes change. If it changes, things change too fast, you go extinct. It's not a big deal unless you're the one being extincted. But, it happens all the time, mainly as a result of climate change. So if we're coming out of it really fast because of human-induced warming, then things are going to get bad. And they are bad, of course. We know that. So we're in an extinction event anyway, the Anthropocene, that is quite dramatic. But if you look, as a geologist, if you look at all of these huge changes, there's always a major extinction event that follows them. So the Devonian, the Permian-Triassic, all of the big extinction events have occurred when these things are changing very fast. And we are changing even faster. Now, this is compressed in the past. So if you compress the present one to this scale, we'd be vertical. So we're going up so fast. It's just incredible. Never in the history of this planet has climate change so fast, temperatures change so fast. Oops. So if you look at, I apologize again for all these graphs without taking the time to derive them. If you look at the IPCC's modeling, most climate modeling, you have two end members. You have A2, which means you don't do anything, business as usual. And you have B1, which is we do everything we possibly can. And as you can see, neither one's great. I mean, A2 is really horrible. So if we don't do anything and we're business, if we're still 2/3 fossil fuel in 2080, we're in rough shape. But even B1, we do everything we possibly can. We're still going to go up, 2 degrees C or 3.5, 4 degrees Fahrenheit. And all we're trying to do here is increase this difference. So we're trying to be as low as we can, but we're not going to get back to 1850. So just not anytime soon. And you all probably know why, because of the half-life of CO2 in the atmosphere is anywhere from 30 to 300 years. So that's tricky, depending upon the degradation route. So again, when we talk about COP21, Paris, or any of the others, it's pretty much the big question is who's going to pay to implement B1? That's the big issue. Who's going to pay for it? How are we going to do it? Now, again, it really depends on where you live. So if we look at B1, which is we do everything we can, Washington State over here doesn't do too badly, which is nice. If we don't do anything, even we don't look all that great. But the central part of the country just is devastated. Now, you probably also encountered people that say, well, if there's more CO2 in the atmosphere, things grow better. It's like, no, they don't. All things equal, they will, but all things are not equal because the temperature is much more effective, has much more effect on the yield of a crop than the CO2 concentration. So as the temperature goes up, the peak temperature during the growing season goes up, the yield goes down significantly. So for Washington State, it doesn't matter A2, B1, apples and cherries do badly, which is horrible because we are the biggest exporter of apples and cherries in the country, if not the world. But grapes and dryland wheat do quite well. So the wine industry is fine. Don't worry. The wine industry is fine. But yeah, so again, as this all evolves, of course, you have to make smart choices on what kind of crops you're going to grow. And in the Tri-Cities, that's important. In Washington State, it's incredibly important. Now, last climate slide. This is the IPCC's projections of how to get to B1. Okay, so how to get to to keep the climate change to within 2 degrees Celsius. So what that means is that in 2011, we would have had to be decreasing carbon emissions, anthropogenic carbon emissions, by almost 4% per year, but we could still have some by mid-century. Well, we blew that one. So 2015 comes around. Now we have to decrease 5% per year, and we have to go basically to zero by 2045. Well, we blew that one. So now we're in 2020, and we're supposed to now decrease carbon emissions by 9% a year and go to zero by 2040. That's why everyone says we only have 10 years, because, yeah, we only have 10 years. And that's a pretty big lift. So, again, if we weren't all muted, I would ask, so how much have we been decreasing a year? And everyone would answer, none, because we are not decreasing, and this is very bad. In fact, every major projection I've seen has us going up at least until 2045. And that, that's ridiculous. We can't do that. I mean, we will just fail if that happens. So it's very simple what we have to do. Get rid of these and bring all these up. Very simple. Not easy, but very simple. So we have to decrease these and bring up these. And if you think we have, let me go back to that other slide. If you think we have the luxury of throwing out any of these, then you're not getting this, okay? This is very bad. These are the only ones we can have. We can't have these, but if we throw these out, if you don't like hydro, you don't like nuclear, you don't like geothermal, you don't like wind turbines on Horseheaven Hills, if you just don't like something, then and you say, well, we don't need that, then you really are not paying attention to the numbers. The numbers say we need all of these as much as possible. So that's what the rest of this talk is going to be about. So And again, if you talk to Jim Hansen, Kerry Emanuel, all the big climate gurus, then pretty much they say you cannot do this without nuclear energy. They should have also put in there, you can't do this without solar, you can't do this without hydro, you can't do this without any of these down here. Okay. Now, of course, a lot of people say, well, we've been pretty good in the United States at decreasing our CO2 emissions. We're at a 27-year low. Yeah, I know that, but it has nothing to do with what we think we're doing. It has to do with replacing coal with natural gas. We've been doing that dramatically. And again, it actually went up for a little bit in 2018. And of course, the pandemic is a horrible reason to decrease, but it's also decreased. But that will turn around. So again, this is billions of tons of emissions from the United States, and we're continuously going up. And then we started in 2006, and I'll talk about why that was the case, started decreasing significantly as a result of replacing coal with natural gas. And the reason that is because we have an awful lot of natural gas. We have an awful lot of everything, actually. We have more fossil fuel than any other country in the world, period. Much more. And that's because in the old days, in the 70s and 80s, when we were in college and graduate school, we'd have to calculate the Hubbard curve, okay, the peak oil, peak coal, peak gas. And peak oil, and peak anything, is calculated only for those things that are economically recoverable at that time. Okay, so in 1970, we would drill a well, and that's it. Okay, now beginning in 2006, we started drilling multiple wells, so we started fracking. So we would have, 12 stringers out from a single well. And it just got too easy to get the stuff out. And as a geologist, I never would have thought we'd get anything out of tight shale. I mean, you just couldn't get anything out of it. Now we can. So things change. Technology changes things dramatically. In this case, it's changing it for the worse. I just want to throw in, this is a Peterson drill rig. It's a walking drill rig. Now let that sink in. This thing picks itself up and walks to the next site. Now, from a science fiction standpoint, that's great. It's really cool. From an environmental standpoint, that's horrible. Okay, it means it's even cheaper and easier now to get stuff out of the ground. And each one of these puts down a stringer, 18,000 feet. I'm sorry, a well 18,000 feet, and then can put 12 stringers off into a mile. Now, it's just too easy to get the stuff out of the ground. So you cannot wait for the idea that it's too hard. We're running out of oil. We're running out of gas. We're not. We won't run out. The peak oil is now 500 years out. We just have so much oil that no one has ever thought we could get out of the ground. That's what's key here. So it's going to take a political will that is really massive to counter the fact that it's so easy to get this stuff out of the ground. So with that, I've set you up. What's the fastest growing energy sources in the world? I usually say, just shout it out. Can you unmute everyone, Steve? Or can I unmute everyone? Well, I'll give you the answer. Terrible. It's oil. It's oil and coal and gas as well. So, I mean, this is terrible. This is not the direction we need to be. Okay, now renewables are coming up. That's great. I love it. But they're not coming up anywhere near as fast as fossil fuels. And you might say, well, why is that the case? This is the world now. This is global. This is not the United States, although gas is leading the United States as well. It's because, especially coal is not the cheapest source of energy. But if you are a poor country with no infrastructure to speak of, coal is all you can do. It doesn't require a lot of infrastructure. Every single other source requires significant infrastructure. So right now, China's One Belt, One Road policy, you probably heard of that, they're spending almost $2 trillion on infrastructure in Africa and Southern Asia in order to install coal. Because it's easy, and they have a lot of coal. They want to sell it, and they want to economically and politically bind these developing countries to them. And this is the best way to do it. I mean, it's actually brilliant. Horribly brilliant, but it's brilliant. So again, coal is simply easy to do. It is not the cheapest. It's simply the easiest if you have no infrastructure. Natural gas, you need pipelines, renewables, you need high voltage transmission lines. I mean, you need a lot of things for all of the other sources. You need the least with coal. So that's something that is driving this, that is not, again, what you think of usually as why. Now, we say, okay, so we're going to take wind energy and we're going to replace coal and oil with wind energy. And maybe we'll replace gas with solar, whatever. But we're just going to replace coal and oil, which are the two worst, with wind energy. And it's going to take about 20 million megawatt wind turbines, or about 10 billion tons of steel and 20 billion tons of cement. Does anyone know what the global production of steel is? About 1.5 billion. So if we're going to need 10 billion tons of steel just for wind over the next 10 or 20 years, that's going to require some global agreements that we're really bad at doing. So we have the steel to do this. And the reason for that is because each energy source requires a different amount of material, but renewables actually require much more materials per megawatt installed. So this is mass of steel in metric ton per megawatt, and this is concrete volume in cubic meter per megawatt, which is about a ton and a half. So what this shows you is that, hydro requires a lot of concrete, but not much steel. Solar requires a lot of steel, but not much concrete. And wind requires both a lot of concrete and a lot of steel. The thermal sources don't require much, but it's just look at gas. Gas doesn't take anything. That's why you can throw a gas plant up in a year, because it just doesn't take anything. It takes 3 tons of steel. I mean, think of that, 3 tons of steel. Whereas wind turbine per megawatt takes 450 tons of steel just for one wind turbine. So this is important. So if we're going to build the renewables out, and also nuclear, we're going to get rid of coal and gas. That means we're going to have to come up with a material plan to do this, because it's just not going to happen on its own. So you're going to have to triple the amount of iron mining, which is not trivial. You're going to have agreements that we're going to save a certain amount or a major portion of the steel production in the world to go to renewable sources. So again, this is not a trivial issue. To me, this is one of the great hurdles that has to be overcome in order to meet any kind of a Green New Deal plan. So any energy plan that has any hope of achieving any of the emission goals we need in the time frame we need them, basically the green part of the Green New Deal, must have some form of the following. So I'm going to lay out what we need. And yes, it's not set in stone. I mean, when you project this far ahead with these huge numbers, there's a huge amount of slop in it. But if you don't have some sort of this, you're going to fail. So we need to stop building new fossil fuel plants. Now that may seem obvious, but we're not doing that. We're still building a lot of new fossil fuel plants. You cannot stop fossil fuel while still building fossil fuel plants. I mean, that doesn't take a rocket science to understand that. The problem is every new fossil fuel plant you build locks you in to fossil fuel for about 40 years. No one is going to decommission a fairly new gas plant. Now, coal, we're not building coal, but again, as I mentioned, the developing world is building coal like crazy, but we're not building coal, we're building gas. And you say, well, gas is a bridge fuel. Okay, bridge fuel, but yeah, bridge to what? I mean, we're talking about 2040. If you build a bunch of new gas plants between now and 2030, those gas plants are going to be running in 2040, no question. So, excuse me, you have to stop building new ones. And that's going to be tough because that's all state legislatures like, is natural gas. You need to stop closing existing nuclear plants that have been relicensed as safe by the NRC, okay, which is almost all the remaining ones. This gets very political, but if you can't spend a penny a kilowatt hour to save 800 billion kilowatt hours a year, then you're not getting this, okay? Because a penny a kilowatt hour is not much to save the planet. And every time we close nuclear, gas replaces it, period. Every single nuclear plant we have closed, we've closed about 10 of them in the last 10 years, every single one has been replaced by natural gas. They all promise to be replaced by something else, but they're not. They're all replaced by natural gas. And every time that happens, emissions go up. Just talk to Vermont and New York and California. So build as many wind turbines as possible and site them in Tornado Alley. You have to, I mean, building wind turbines in a place that doesn't produce a lot of energy is a waste of steel. So if we're worried about steel, we're worried about building, 20 million wind turbines, you need to put them in the right place. And for the United States, that is Tornado Alley. So here is Tornado Alley. It's a good thing. This is where you want to put it. If you start building wind turbines out here in the green, you really are wasting your time and money and steel. And I hate to be harsh, but it is. It's a total waste of time. So we don't have that luxury to waste. So wind turbines have to go in areas where it's red or orange. And there's plenty. I mean, we couldn't possibly cover this much. And there's very few pristine areas left in Tornado Alley. There's lots of pristine areas left on the West Coast. And that is one of the issues we have. Now, let's see, do you all know what capacity factor is? Okay, it's the percentage of the time that the power plant is producing what it's supposed to produce. So a 1 megawatt wind turbine produces 1 megawatts, but 1 megawatt if it's turning at 30 miles per hour all the time. That doesn't happen. But out here in the Horseheaven Hills, the capacity factor is about 27%. In Tornado Alley, it's 45%. So you're getting a lot more energy out of the same unit, out of the same amount of steel, out of the same amount of time. So that's why it's important to do that. So the same thing with solar. So here we go. Put rooftop solar on all new buildings. If you put solar on a new building and you amortize the cost of that over the mortgage of the building, you won't even feel it. Okay, now retrofitting, I retrofitted my roof with solar panels. That's fairly expensive for most people because you're retrofitting it. But if you put it on all new buildings, you won't even feel the cost of that. But again, you need to do it in areas that have a high capacity factor, at least 200 sunny days a year. So we're talking about the red and orange. Okay, now here's Tri-Cities. That's why mine's okay. That's why the new solar array that's going up for Energy Northwest is going to work very well. But if you're putting solar panels out here or up here, you're wasting steel. And we don't have a lot of steel to waste. Certainly don't want them in Alaska. And build small modular reactors as fast as possible. They can't melt down. All the scary stuff has been fixed. We have not been idle in the last 30 years. And SMRs are built to load follow or buffer renewables instead of building new natural gas plants. So it's either SMRs or nuclear or hydro. That's all you have to load follow. Now, Texas actually load follows a bunch of their wind farms with coal, which is horrible. Ramping coal up and down is really dirty. So, and of course, you probably heard of NuScale down in Oregon. Brilliant, it's already approved. Been there lots of times. Again, it's great. And the first one should be built in Utah, basically to load follow the wind farms of the Utah public utility, UAMPS. It turns out we can double hydro in this country without building a single new dam. That's very important. So there are a bunch of dams. It turns out only 3% of our dams generate electricity. So if you electrify existing dams that don't presently produce power and uprate some of the others to produce more power, and in place some pumped hydro storage too, we can do an awful lot without building a single new dam. So here's all the dams in America that can be electrified. And what's important is that, as we know, of course, from the Pacific Northwest, hydro is wonderful for load following renewables. All right. It's either natural gas, small modular reactors, or hydro. Those are the only things you really can load follow correctly. The intermittency of renewables. So if you're going to start building a bunch of renewables here in Tornado Alley, you better have a bunch of hydro or a bunch of small modular reactors to load follow them, to buffer them. Otherwise, it's just going to be gas. I mean, you probably remember T. Boone Pickens. He recently died, but he was touting wind. He was a gas man. I knew him from a long time ago. He didn't care about the environment. He didn't care about the planet. He bought up all the water rights in Texas along the areas that were going to put wind in because he's a gas man. He knew when you install significant amount of wind, you need gas or hydro or small modular. So, if you don't do this, you'll have much less ability to load follow the renewables you have to put here. Now, as you all know, we use hydro to load follow our wind farms in the BPA area in the Pacific Northwest. So every time wind comes up, this is a weekly load map. So the load, the power being taken out of the system by people is in red. Hydro is in blue. Thermal are one coal plant, the one nuclear plant, and the two gas plants are in brown, and then green is wind. So pretty much, hydro buffers everything. It load follows completely. So when wind comes up, suddenly you have to drop hydro dramatically, and when it goes away, you raise it up. So we only use hydro in this region to load follow renewables. So hydro is a really great thing to have. So if you're going to be putting in a lot of renewables, hydro is great. You can't start taking out hydro thinking, okay, well, we don't like hydro, so we're going to take that out. Well, then you're going to be stuck with natural gas, and you'll never reach your carbon goals at all. If we're going to build alternative electric vehicles, which are the best? I mean, hydrogen's okay. It's not very good. Methane is still methane. But really, electricity is the most efficient fuel for a vehicle. It's about 4 times more efficient than oil, than petroleum. So if you're going to do that, we're going to have, again, materials are an issue. Lithium, cobalt, iron, and other materials, neodymium. You're not going to do this unless you secure large sources of these. And right now, we buy these mostly from China. Now, we have rare earth element mines in the United States. Used to know one down in Southern California, but China pretty much, with government assistance, undercut every rare earth element mine in the world. And so they all shut down. So again, money's important. I get it. We're America. Everyone's going to make a buck. I get it. But you need to get sources of these materials, even if they're not competitive with China. The point is not to make only to make money. I mean, you're going to make money, but the point is not just to make money. You simply need sources of these materials. And if they cost a little bit more in the United States, you have to bear that if you're going to meet these goals. We need to build a huge fleet of electric vehicles, not a couple of million. We need at least 150 million. We need 2 billion globally by 2040, which is a really tough lift there. That's the only way to significantly reduce oil. That's it. We need a lot of charging stations. We're actually getting pretty good at that. And then we need to streamline the process to site and approve high voltage transmission lines. We can't do this without them. Okay? Every time a state approves a huge renewable build, the public throws out the high voltage transmission lines with it. It's like, you can't do that without, you need them both. And most of, you probably don't know, but they have to be high voltage DC, not AC. Okay. AC actually loses a lot more power with distance than DC does. And the cost, again, if we're going to be doing large renewable farms like wind farms in Tornado Alley, you're going to have to distribute that power widely. So unless you want to go bankrupt, it better be DC lines. In fact, the only large high voltage transmission line that was built in the last 20 years is a DC line from Texas to Tennessee. So this is we got this down, but it's going to be DC. So to bring this all together, in America, this new low carbon plan will require 500,000 new megawatts installed wind turbines that will produce 1.75 trillion kilowatt hours a year. 200,000 megawatts of new nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, to produce 1.58 trillion. 300,000 new megawatts of solar, and 120,000 new megawatts of hydro. With the existing hydro, these big dams are going to last a long time. And again, this gets you up to where we'll be about 5 trillion kilowatt hours in America by 2040. Now, that's just America. For the world, you pretty much multiply everything by 7. But I'll get back to that. So the present energy mix in America is this, and we need it to go to that. So very simple. This is where it is now. We need to go to this. Or some version of this. I mean, it doesn't have to be exact, of course, but it has to pretty much get rid of coal. The reason I have some gas here is because these are the new gas plants being built now. Again, if you let more gas plants be built, you're going to lock yourself into gas for the life of that plant. So this is by 2040 for a mix of to produce 5 trillion kilowatt hours. And there's going to be some gas because we are still building gas plants. My fear, of course, is that this gas is going to be up here. That's the true fear. And it's most likely that's going to be the case. So pretty much gas will be where nuclear is if we don't exert some extreme political will. And this is hydro if we just electrify non-power producing dams without building a single new dam. Now this in America will take about 500 million tons of steel. That's not too bad. But again, the United States only produces about 70 million tons. We don't produce billions, we produce millions. So again, we're going to either have to increase our mining and our production of steel, again, like we used to, or we're going to have international agreements to secure the amount of steel we need for that. Okay, oh my God. All right. Does the chart on energy distribution for transportation include electric vehicles? It does, because the sliver is so small. There's so few electric vehicles that it doesn't even register on that pie chart, if that's what you're talking about. Barbara, what about nuclear waste? Now that's a whole other talk, but is my specialty. Nuclear waste is a piece of cake. We know exactly what to do with it, how much it's going to cost. We're just not allowed to do it. And what we are doing is stupid. So that's a scientific term for those of us in the business. But yeah, so get me back to talk about nuclear waste, because that's actually fascinating, much more fascinating than you think. So what's going on out here at Hanford is not at all what you think. What's going on with Yucca Mountain is not at all what you think. We know what to do. It's not that difficult. It's fairly cheap. We're just not doing it. So very, very important. Okay. What do you think of the site, Scout Energy's plans to build new wind turbines? That's a good point. And if you look at my wind resource map of the United States, it's pretty much in the green area, which, as I was saying, isn't all that great. If you want to build wind turbines, you need to really build them in red and orange areas where you have a capacity factor that is worthy of the amount of steel that you're using to do. So again, I don't want to rain on anyone's wind farm, but again, yeah, we have a resource issue. If you're going to be spending $2 trillion, what are you going to be spending it on? Or are you going to do this kind of thing and then require $3 trillion? Well, yeah, I mean, I know we're rich. We're supposed to get a laugh, but but as we go into a global depression or another great recession, we really need to be smart about what we're spending on. What is the energy source for making steel? Now, that's a good question. Right now, it's coal, or usually coal, although it can be anything. But for most industrial sources, let me put my headphones back on. For most industrial sources, you need a constant source of energy because you can't have like a manufacturing plant and have, in intermittent energy surges and blackouts and things like that. You need a constant source of energy. So generally, you think of either hydro or thermal as doing that. Slide. Okay, does everyone see that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So the big question, of course, once you come up with a mix that you think you want, that you think will meet your needs, how much is it going to cost? And that's not trivial. But keep in mind this, though. Are the costs differences amongst the various energy sources sufficiently different to justify unethical decisions? Meaning, if you only make $1, are you going to make bad choices? Or if you can make $10, then you're going to make even worse choices. Or if, well, there's only a few pennies, so why are we, we'll make the right choices and we'll pay a little bit more. This is important because everything, mostly to get to where we want to be, is going to cost a little more. And so you're going to have to get people to pay a little bit more or make corporations not make as much money. Oops. Okay, so this is an interesting study out of Rice University in Austin. UT Austin in Texas. Energy has never been cheaper than it is now. All right. Now, can everyone see the end of this curve here? Now, you pretty much, and as a GDP, as a percentage of GDP. Now, of course, before 1850, it was all muscle work and food essentially. Windmills and water wheels and things like that. But come 1850, this huge drop is, of course, the result of coal and everything else. Now, there's a little peak here that is the 73 oil embargo that many of us remember. I went from paying 32 cents a gallon to $2 a gallon in a month, and I freaked out since it was my first car. So anyway, it's never been cheaper than it is now. And as a result of that, food has never been cheaper than it is now. So if you're going to make these super changes, then now is the time to do it, because it won't always be this cheap, or it shouldn't always be this cheap. So again, you're going to make huge changes, and when you do that, it's good that energy is cheap now. So how much will a new energy mix cost? So I'm just going to use the levelized costs. I hate levelized costs. I don't know if you all love them or not, but I hate them because they have a lot of junk in them that aren't real, that aren't actual technological or scientific. They have depreciation costs from banks. I don't care about that. We don't finance this stuff very well anyway. So you need to decide what you want and then how you're going to finance it. You don't start up front financing because venture capitalists will gouge you in the first 5 years and we'll never get to any kind of a mix that we want. So I'm going to use these levelized costs per kilowatt hour from the Northwest Inter-Resource, I can't remember what IRP is, Inter-Resource Plan. And pretty much what this shows is, gas is the cheapest. We know that. Coal is actually the most expensive. These are all great. Now, this does not include subsidies. But what's funny here is that everything is within a cent of 6.5 cents or so. I mean, that's not a lot of difference, especially since most places the energy cost is so high that, if you're in Vermont, it's 18 cents a kilowatt hour, but these are still the same. So what's all that money coming and going? I mean, how come the price is so much more than the cost? And cost and price is not the same. Price is what you can get away with charging. Cost is what it actually takes what it costs to produce a kilowatt hour of energy from that source. Okay, so that's actually key. So right now, Energy Northwest, the nuclear plant out here, produces a kilowatt of energy, a kilowatt of electricity for 4 cents. All right, and they've guaranteed that for the next 20 years. So 4 cents. Hydro is making it for 2.5 cents. All right, but we still get charged 8 cents. So there's a lot of other stuff in there. Okay, there's structural costs. You have to maintain the grid. There's congestion costs. There's all sorts of weird costs in there, taxes and stuff that have nothing to do with the cost of producing electricity. So this is just the cost of producing electricity. And these are costs for new builds. So this is building an old nuclear reactor. We're not going to build any of those anymore. We're going to build SMRs, and they're going to be a lot cheaper. But again, we're just going to use this. So if we use that to produce 5 trillion kilowatt hours a year by mid-century in the U.S., with the present mix, which is 2/3 fossil fuel and 1/3 everything else, is going to cost 9 trillion, of which 1.7 trillion is capital. Now that sounds like a lot of money, but by mid-century, that's not that much money. Actually, that's pretty good. And so this is business as usual. Now, the reason it costs so much is because you have to pay for gas and coal and oil, and you have to you don't have to build a lot because fossil fuel is mainly all about the fuel. And so, well, but again, you have to build new gas plants, you have to build wind farms and things like that. So the 1.7 trillion is capital investment, and most of the 9 trillion is other like fuel. Now, if we do that with this mix that I'm proposing, renewable hydro nuclear, it's going to cost, 9 trillion. Exactly the same, 9 trillion, of which 4 trillion is capital. So now instead of 1.7 trillion, you're going to have 4 trillion because now you're building things and not buying as much fuel, right? So you're not spending all your money on natural gas or oil or coal. Now you're spending it on steel and cement, things like that. So that's why the capital is so much, although the total cost is the same. So the problem here is that you're going to have to ask the public to put up more capital up front. They'll save it later, but they're going to have to pay more up front. And of course, people have a hard time with that, right? Now, if we go all However, this mix, which uses almost no fossil fuel, saves 4 billion tons of CO2 a year, and the healthcare savings alone will bring you $4 trillion. Now, we all know coal is dirty and it causes upper respiratory effects and things like that. There was a study out of Canada that showed if your society has a significant amount of coal in it, over 30% of its generation, then your healthcare costs are increased by about 10%. So that's $400 billion a year for the United States. So that's why this $4 trillion is savings in healthcare that more than covers the capital investment. Because, again, business as usual is 1.7 trillion. So now we're going to go to 4 trillion and we're going to save 4 trillion. So it's a real savings. But again, you have to ask the public to put up front more capital. Now, if you do just renewable only, like Jacobson's stuff down at Stanford, then your total cost is going to be 20 trillion. Now that's a lot, and there's no way we can afford that. Of which 16 trillion is capital, because now renewables is all about capital, right? It's all about building. It doesn't cost much to operate them. So now most of this 20 trillion is now capital investment up front, and we just can't. And you'll still have 4 trillion in savings from healthcare, but that's not enough to cover the increased capital. So for the world, at 35 trillion kilowatt hours a year, the total cost for a renewable nuclear hydro mix is about 65 trillion, including 28 trillion in capital. Again, it sounds like a lot, but it's actually not much for the world, producing 35 trillion kilowatt hours a year. Now, anything that's going to include a lot of renewables and high voltage transmission lines and everything, the infrastructure is important. And the American Society of Civil Engineers recently gave us a D plus on our energy infrastructure. Okay, not good. We're not going to be putting all this over our infrastructure if we don't have an infrastructure bill, which we should have had years ago, because infrastructure is something that really helps. You can't spend enough on infrastructure and not get huge benefits out of it. So again, American Society of Civil Engineers said by 2025, aging infrastructure is going to cost our economy about $7 trillion. That's scary. So bridges, falling down, things like that. We need that. Fortunately, the aging infrastructure in the energy sector will only account for about 300 billion of that. But again, infrastructure. So if you look at generating capacity, most of our capacity is over 10 years old. A lot of it, half of it, is over 50 years old. And these, all the big hydro, like, Grand Coulee and stuff, is out here. And nuclear is spread between these two boxes, and most of the renewables is out here. Now, what about the other costs? The costs that are not direct. You've probably heard, oh God, what's the term, Steve? Just anyway, the other externalities, external costs, externalities. They're not direct costs. They don't come at the end of your month in the bill at the end of the month, but someone's going to pay for them at some point. Either your grandchildren, polar bears, someone's going to pay for it, but they're real costs. We don't really know how to capture these. We kind of, we say, okay, we try to assign a cost per ton of CO2, maybe $15 a ton, $40 a ton, whatever you want to assign that as a value. The EU has assigned, $100 an acre for physical footprint, which they just pulled right out of the air. There's no real reason for that, but okay, we can work with that. So if you look at that, and then we have, I put over here a carbon tax of $15 per ton of CO2 emitted per generation source, and what that increase is going to be for that source. So obviously, a carbon tax hurts fossil fuel because it's all about the fuel. It's all about carbon. Not much carbon here, although not trivial. Nuclear wind have the lowest carbon footprints because of the construction. That's all. It's all construction. CO2 for solar is actually kind of big because of the solvents used to make them, and of course, hydro is big cement. Okay, so that's what that CO2 is. Plus a fair amount of backwater methane generation in the water behind the dams, which is important in the east, but not that important out west. So again, these are the footprints. And then the physical footprint, not much for fossil fuel. A lot of footprint for renewables, and this includes the water backed up behind the dam. And then nuclear, unintuitively, doesn't have much of an impact on either one. Now, there's the other externality, the death print. Now, the death print, you're going to shove coal off to the side because coal kills so many people. And if you need an evil, coal's evil. That's great. And if you need it, okay. And this is mainly health induced, although there are some accidental deaths in there as well. Same thing, gas still has a fair amount of death print. This is global, by the way. This is global. Hydro has a fair amount of death. I mean, that's kind of bizarre. You don't think of hydro as being dangerous because in the United States it's not, because we actually inspect our dams. But when a dam goes out around the world, it pretty much takes out an entire village. It's actually quite devastating, but doesn't happen that often. These here for solar, wind, and nuclear are simple accidents. So falling off a ladder, breaking your neck, falling off a wind turbine during maintenance. This in nuclear in the last 5 years was someone falling off scaffolding and broke his neck. Okay, I got that. So these are just accidents. This is mega accident, and these are health effects. Now, these are the numbers that go into that death print. So this is mortality rate per trillion kilowatt hours, so it's normalized. The global average, about 100,000 people die per trillion kilowatt hour. And since coal produces about 80% 8 trillion kilowatt hours a year. That's 800,000 dead a year from coal. That's not a trivial amount. Coal in China is even worse, of course. They've gotten a little bit better. 10 years ago, this was 250,000. The United States, we only kill 10,000. That's not bad. Supposed to get a laugh. It's terrible, okay? But hey, it's not as bad as the rest of the world. Oil's not great. Now it starts going down. The World Health Organization recently concluded that biomass in the third world was an epidemic because of poor ventilation in third world countries where they're burning biomass indoors. So this is not trivial either. And then again, all of these are just accidents. Now, what's funny is that for some of these, I have, global average and then U.S. So for coal, hydro, and nuclear, I have a global average and then I have a U.S. number. Why are we so good in the United States at not killing people at the same levels as the rest of the world? Usually I say, shout that out, since you all probably get regulations. Regulation. So this number here is a result of the Clean Air Act. So when I hear people talking about changing the Clean Air Act, I want to kill them. Sorry. But yeah, so this, the Clean Air Act is arguably the single piece of legislation that has saved the most lives in history. Then is hydro here. Hydro, this is a fairly big number, but in the United States, 5 people, and those 5 people died merely from accidental death like falling off a ladder. And why is that so good? FERC, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they actually inspect dams. And they recently inspect, Priest Rapids out here, found a crack and shut Priest Rapids down until you fix it. A lot of countries don't do that. Then nuclear. Okay, so this includes, worst case Chernobyl. I threw in a couple of hundred deaths from Fukushima, though no one's going to die from radiation from Fukushima. But just to be nice, I threw in a bunch of deaths. The United States, why is that? NRC. Okay, a lot of people think they're cozy with the industry, but the industry hates NRC. They shut them down for nothing. So that's why this point 1 is actually a person who died about 3 years ago falling off some scaffolding. I think it was a Browns Ferry. But yeah, so no one ever dies because we are heavily regulated. Same thing with hydro and even coal. So we regulate like crazy, and the more regulation, to me, the better. So here we have Beijing right now, which is 80% coal. So this is Beijing is 80% coal. And if, this is not very healthy. They recently started putting up large screen TVs because they realized it's depressing never to see the sky. Now, this is not how I would have addressed this issue, but hey, it's interesting. Interesting use of tech. So I just want to kind of end up here with, again, if I had the audience in front of me, I would say just shout out, what do you think the most dangerous thing is in this group? This is averaged over the past 5 years to smooth out some of the peaks. And of course, everyone talks about alcohol. Yep, it's in the top 5. Auto drive. Yep, it's top 5. I've set you up for coal. I put in opioid deaths. That's terrible. Food poisoning. Yeah. Smoking, of course, always a bad one. And now Steve and I and others have to worry about accidental falls. So, well, I'll just get to this. Iatrogenic and smoking. Smoking, this number jumped up recently. I think it's because they changed the calculation of it. It used to be second, but iatrogenic. What the heck is iatrogenic? It is medicine gone wrong. It is not malpractice. It is not abuse of drugs. That's down here with opioids, which is horrible anyway. It's simply don't know why the patient died. That's really actually kind of scary. So when you go, since I know these, every time I go to the hospital, I get a little worried. And why are we still killing people with hamburgers? I mean, that many people? Really? And, nuclear is one. So a biostatistician gave me grief recently because I hadn't normalized the subpopulation. Smoking really is the worst, always has been. Iatrogenic drops to 3 because so many people receive medical treatment. yeah, police work is not that many people dead, but there's not that many police officers, right? The same thing with minors. Not that many die, but there's not that many minors. So the relative danger index is rather high. It's nice to know that, food poisoning is only slightly more dangerous than nuclear power. That's kind of nice. That's supposed to get a laugh too. But yeah, so again, these are the things you have to worry about killing you, not something like nuclear power. Now, even non-lethal accidents like falling off a ladder, it's safer to work at a nuclear power plant than it is to sit at a desk trading stocks. Now, this is all OSHA. This is all real data. Now, why would that be? And usually, again, I ask the audience or the class, and it's the same answer as the previous question. Regulation, regulation, regulation. So trading stocks is not inherently more dangerous than nuclear power, okay? But it's just no one is thinking of safety at an office building. So at a nuclear power plant, I mean, when I used to work out at Hanford or even at Los Alamos, I had to take ladder training. I didn't know that much about ladders. It was an interesting course. I kind of found it fascinating, but ladder training. You cannot operate a ladder on a nuclear site without two qualified operators that have had ladder training. So do you think anyone ever falls off a ladder at a nuclear power plant? Of course not. So, but at the 8th story of the AIG building in New York, someone is standing on a rolling chair, hanging a picture, and that, and they fall and they break their arm, and it gets reported to OSHA, and that's what these numbers are. Now, of course, this is really inherently more dangerous. Pouring 500-ton ingots of molten steel is actually quite dangerous, and so people tend to die more or get hurt more. So why is everyone so afraid of nuclear energy? And the answer is because we told you to be. Sorry, my bad. Yeah, we've been telling you for 50 years to be really afraid. It was the reason for the one of the reasons for the Cold War. It was intentional but incorrect association with nuclear weapons during the Cold War. We meant to scare everyone so no one would use nuclear weapons, and it kind of worked. Inaccurate, purposefully simplistic modeling. We can't get into linear no threshold dose hypothesis here, but it's really the real reason why everyone's so afraid, and it's incorrect. It's not scientifically based. And then misunderstanding of the amount of nuclear power waste, spent nuclear fuel. People always come back to that. It's just not much of it. We're talking about one landfill. All the nuclear waste in the world, weapons waste as well as commercial waste, would fit in one big landfill. So there's just, I know it's weird stuff, it's odd stuff, but it's just not much of it. The amount of toxic solid cold waste produced every 30 minutes equals all of the nuclear waste ever produced in the world. So, I mean, volume really makes a difference. And we know what to do with it, but get me back, Steve, to talk about nuclear waste. Okay, so for the world, this new low-carbon plan will require 4 million new megawatts of wind turbines, 1.4 million new megawatts of reactors, 2.2 million new megawatts of solar, and 1.1 million new megawatts of hydro, or some variation of that. But if it includes a lot of gas and coal, then we will fail. It's just the way it is. What is keeping modular reactors from being more acceptable to utilities? From Laura. Pretty much the same thing. It's fear. Also, it's investors, because one of the problems, that's why everyone loves gas, because as I mentioned, you can throw a gas plant up in a year. So an investor can get real return in the next 5 years. So utilities, that's a good investment for them economically. Nuclear, who knows? We haven't built one in so long. So, UAMPS is probably going to build the first small modular reactor. It'll probably be built by 2025, probably, if all goes well. All right, that's not real confidence in terms of investment. So that's why you need government support for anything that's new. I mean, that's why wind and solar benefited incredibly from government support over the last 10, 20 years. You need that in order to get over the hump of building. Once you build the first one or the first 10, then suddenly people have confidence that, yeah, this works, it's going to work. But until you get to that point, I wouldn't expect utilities to be jumping up and down for SMRs. That's why the NuScale one really has to get built in Utah and on time, and I think it will be because it's a brilliant design, and the NuScale people are brilliant engineers. So, but that's why. Why is hydro cost so high? It's just one of those big things like nuclear. It just is a huge regulatory hurdle. It's a lot of cement. You have to divert the river. I mean, it's actually a big deal to build those. Let's see. Integrated resource plan. Thank you, Lori. Integrated resource plan is the IRP. Would it be possible? Okay. If success depends on coordinated planning on a global scale, how can we imagine that kind of strategy? Yeah, that's a big deal. First of all, we need a change in certain leadership around the world. I mean, right now, the big, here's Xi Jinping, is president for life. He's going to do coal. No one's going to stop him. We got Putin. We got Trump. I mean, we got people that don't do global agreements very well. And that's, to me, what is going to be the big hurdle. We need people in charge of the world, different parts of the world, that actually care about this, right? Let's see. Can he answer his last question in a few sentences? I'm sorry, Barbara, not sure what that meant.
Oh, the question you said about what happens if we don't do anything.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so what we have, then we have to actually take direct action in lowering the temperature of the atmosphere. So we actually have to shoot small reflective particles, which sounds weird, into the atmosphere, but it's what a large volcano does all the time. As a geologist, we know that when Krakatoa erupted, the global temperature dropped for 2 degrees for 2 years. So we know how to do this. And of course, smoke and stuff, soot is not what you want to shoot up there. Probably ground mother of pearl, which is actually brilliant. And after 2 years, it falls into the ocean, which can address ocean acidification a little bit as well. So we have the ability to do this. We just have to put the research dollars into how to do it well.
Okay, so I misunderstood. That kind of I thought you were going to say if we don't do this, we're all going to die.
No, unfortunately, humans are ornery. We don't die very easily. It's kind of, I guess it's good, but it's kind of a bummer from a planetary perspective. I mean, the Black Death doesn't even register on the population growth curve, and it killed a third of Europe. But it didn't change, the growth curve of human population. It's really hard to kill us, I guess, is a good way to put it. So what we would have to do is just take action like that. So either carbon capture, which is really difficult but not impossible, things like that. So there's about 10 different strategies that we can do. But solar geoengineering. So Google Conca Forbes solar geoengineering, and that will come up.
Sue Kane had a question, Jim. Is this presentation common knowledge to scientists and policymakers?
No, but it should be. Some parts of it are. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that Jim Hansen talks about and others. Even Bill Gates has given a version of the first part of the talk, the HDI part, and why we need so much energy. And then he segues into what that should be. So, people know this, but they don't have it all in one place. And if you don't think of it in a holistic term, you're just not going to get the gist of what we have to do and how difficult some parts are and how easy some parts are. But other people have. I mean, if you go in and look at, like Berkeley people, how much do you have to price carbon to make a difference? And they came up with pretty much it has to be $40 a ton or more. Below that, you just don't, the fossil fuel industry just absorbs it. It doesn't cause any real change unless it's above $40 a ton. If you don't price carbon in some way, then, as far as I'm concerned, the alternatives are, don't get in because there's no financial incentive to do it. I want to say something quick about jobs, green jobs, okay? The energy industry is great jobs. It doesn't matter what source you have, okay? It just is great jobs. Now, nuclear produces more jobs per megawatt than anything else, but the number of jobs is relatively trivial to the value of the electricity being produced. So the jobs that depend on that electricity are more important and much more numerous than the jobs to produce that electricity. See what I'm saying? So if you're producing a lot of energy, you're going to have a lot of jobs downstream, and it doesn't really matter what jobs you're creating that energy. They're small in comparison, and it doesn't matter what energy what source you're working in. So I mean, jobs in the oil industry pay really well. Jobs in the renewable industry pay really well. Jobs in the nuclear industry pay really well. They all pay well. There's no crappy job in energy. It's just, unless you're a janitor at some, but even they pay well. So, people talk about great jobs. It's a red herring. It's not that important. Okay. Any energy source you put in creates jobs.
Okay, I think we've had our questions answered. Let's all thank Jim. Very good. Very good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.